Hi, this is Ryan Thomas with East West, here with another Composer Cloud tutorial. And today is just going to be a blast. We're going to be looking at the Gospel Choirs demo that was written for one of the 1-minute Composer Cloud tips. And, I have to say this piece was just a ton of fun to write. I actually grew up playing music a lot like this with my church orchestra. I play saxophone as well as other woodwinds and piano, of course. And some of my earliest musical influences were just legendary church music composers like Bradley Knight and Don Marsh. And if you're familiar with that side of the industry, you'll probably hear some familiar gospel music tropes. Now, this piece will be quite different from the other tutorials because we aren't really dealing with any orchestral elements here besides strings. And even then, arranging pop strings is pretty different from working with strings in an orchestral context. So for this tutorial, we're going to dip our feet in some pop arranging and mixing techniques that I hope will be useful to you. Now, I want to remind you that the entire patch list for all the instruments I'm using in this demo is available to you in the video description. If you just follow those links, you will find the patch list, and I would encourage you to download it and be referring to it while you watch this video. That said, let's go ahead and dig in. And we will just take it right at the top. Okay, let's stop there and break it down, starting with piano. Now, I do have a confession to make. This is not me playing the piano. So as it turned out, my parents came up to visit me and my wife while I was in the middle of writing this piece, and coincidentally, my mom happens to be just a legendary gospel pianist. She's played with some of the greats, and that is the style that she really excels in. So I thought it would be really cool if she added some authentic gospel flair to it. So I had already written the piece, I had written the chord changes and had a basic piano part, but she listened to it and banged this out in about 15 minutes and just absolutely killed it. So this is actually her playing piano. There's not really going to be much to talk about in terms of MIDI programming with the piano because this is just how she played it in. And you can see all the sustain pedal information here, but other than that, there's really not much more to say. Now, I do want to show you the mic positions I'm using because I don't think they're the default mic positions out of the box, but you can see all my settings right there. Okay, let's add the organ. And we're just going to start here at measure 2 where the organ comes in. And I just gotta say, this sample is just absolutely beautiful. This is actually the B3 rock organ from Goliath. Just an absolute gem. Just really worked for this piece. And I also decided to add a Rhodes piano here. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I'm not really sure how to use it in this particular context. So I knew that the piece needed to be a piano-driven piece, but I also kind of just wanted that Rhodes sound as another layer because the mix wasn't sounding quite full enough for me. And so rather than turning to EQ or some other effects, I just decided to add the Rhodes as another layer. So it's mostly doubling the piano, but occasionally it does its own thing. So let's go ahead and give it a listen. Okay, and you can see just with my EQ here that I am cutting a lot out of this Rhodes because, again, I just needed something to fill up some space, and it's really just more felt than heard. And same story with the guitar. You don't really hear it that much, but in the context of the mix, it really just helps to add some extra color. Now let's add our drums, and we just have some light cymbal work here. And we've got this fill. All right, now let's add our vocals. And we start the piece off with just a really cool phrase from the Voices of Soul library. This is the key switch patch, and I've just got the C0 key switch triggered here. And I'm using the Hollywood Backup Singers vowel key switch patch here with the OO articulation triggered. It's just such a beautiful patch. I love the way that the vibrato evolves through the note. It's so natural and just so musical. Okay, now let's add the brass. We're going to start at measure 2. Okay, and as you can hear, the brass is actually fairly thin. The way that I have it mixed, I am just using the individual instrument mics. I'm not using any of the room mics or anything like that. And that's something that you will encounter quite often, especially in gospel mixes and in a lot of pop music mixes. The brass is fairly thin, but the library itself, if you have all the mic positions enabled, sounds quite full. So it only sounds thin by virtue of how I have it mixed. And I'm actually going to let you hear the brass on its own, just so that you can better understand how it's fitting into this mix. And that has nothing to do with the library. It has everything to do with how I have it mixed, how I have it EQ'd. A lot of the mids are gutted, and that's just because with instruments like piano and guitar filling up a lot of that space in the mids and in the low mids, brass can really very quickly create a cluttered mix. So in this case, I've got, the saxophone here is panned all the way to the right, and I'm just using the one sax mic. So essentially you're getting a mono signal from the saxophone here. Same thing with the trombones, but they're panned all the way to the left. And the trumpets are in the center, but I'm only using the close mic. Again, just to give you an idea of how brass can often sound in mixes like these, they fit really well in the context of the mix. And in fact, I've been really pleased with how well Hollywood Pop Brass sits in the mix. But again, this is one of those elements that's going to be more felt than heard. And you can still hear it, poking out in the mix at certain parts of the piece. And it's really satisfying when it does. Hollywood Pop Brass has a really nice edge to it when you push those dynamics up. And they've also got a really nice mellow character when those dynamics are lower. Let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the piece. And we will start back at measure 2 so that you can hear how it's building into this groove. Introducing the strings. Let's go ahead and stop it there and break everything down. We will start with the piano again. And there's not going to be much to talk about here. This is just how it was played in, so there's not really much MIDI programming. Just some beautiful playing there. All right, now let's add the organ. Now, if you noticed, we went from kind of doing this lead line here to just supporting the chords in measure 7 and 8. And, that's just to switch things up and keep things interesting. Now let's add the Rhodes. And I'm also going to go ahead and add the guitar as well, because the Rhodes and the guitar are kind of doing the same thing, which is to say that they're just filling out the mix in a very subtle way. You don't really hear either of them distinctly. So this is what they're doing. Fairly self-explanatory. Again, there's really no MIDI programming to discuss here. Let's add the drum kit. This was all programmed by hand, so I'm not using any loops here. And I think I'm just using the kit as it loads. This is the Spike Stent Kit 3 from Pro Drummer. All right, now let's add our bass. It's just such a satisfying bass sound, and I'm just using the Goliath, the 72 Rickenbacker. Okay, let's add our vocals here. And we are going from an ooh articulation back from measure 2 to measure 5 and switching that to an ah articulation, which I really like to do. It's a subtle way to build energy without actually adding anything. And we're adding some phrases from the Voices of Soul just to add some extra color, as well as some word builder phrases. And we will get to that in just a moment. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about what we're doing here with Hollywood backup singers. Now, I went ahead and bounced this MIDI data out to audio just because I wanted to be able to start in the middle of a phrase without having to worry about where the word builder was going to start. Obviously, if I start here at measure 9, the word builder is going to start me at the beginning of the phrase. So there's no voodoo going on here. This is purely just to make recording the video easier on me. But what you are hearing is exactly this MIDI data. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up what I'm doing in the word builder here. We've been getting a lot of questions in the comments about word builder, so I'm going to spend some time here taking you through what all I'm doing. So they're saying, even in the darkest night, remember always, but we're actually cutting this off at re for this phrase. So let's listen to them by themselves. Okay, now a few things I want to point out. You can see how I've got things offset here because, as I've explained in previous videos, oftentimes you will need to have different values for your note offsets with word builder patches because certain phonemes take longer to sound out. For example, the S phoneme, it takes longer to sound out than something like duh or ta. So that's not a problem with the library, that's just how human language works. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that when you are working on a word builder syllable, this phoneme here is going to actually sound after the end of the MIDI note. So in even, you're not actually going to hear that N until right here, okay, because that's the end of the MIDI note. And that N is going to sound out for exactly, in this case, 120 milliseconds. So that is why I have this space between this chord here and this chord here. So let's listen to that. Because I want to give them the time to sound out that N before getting to the next word, or it won't be clear. Now, here, because they are going from a vowel, because this word here is the, and this word here is darkest, I didn't need that space, because there's no consonant here at the end of the word that they need the time to sound out. So that, I think, is a really crucial principle when working with the word builder patches, is that whatever comes after these two bars here is going to sound after the end of your MIDI note. So just keep that in mind and it will make your life a lot easier. Okay, let's go ahead and add our brass. So we're going to solo everything again. All right, so there's a little bit of key switch programming going on in the brass. We're starting off in the key switches, and they're all unison at measure 5, and then they break out into 2 parts in measure 6, and then go full 3-part harmony in measure 7, and we transition to the legato patches. Okay, let's add our strings. All right, nothing too complicated here. These are just the legato patches from Hollywood Strings that I use in all my other sessions. And just note that we are going from an open chord voicing in bars 5 and 6 to then a closed chord voicing in bar 7 and 8, just to switch things up and make it interesting, because that is the name of the game. Okay, that does it for that section. Let's go ahead and move on to this next phrase here. So let's go ahead and start right at measure 7 for context. And let's stop there. That is a great stopping point. So there's a lot going on here. Let's start with piano. And as you probably noticed, here in measure 9, we kind of drop down in dynamics, and we also drop all of our bass elements. And that's just so that we can have something to build towards. Remember, always give yourself a place to go. That holds true whether it's, orchestral arranging or whether you're dealing with more modern genres like this. So let's check out what the piano's doing here. All right, let's add the organ. One thing I wanted to point out is that they just absolutely nailed the vibrato response in this patch. You can hear how it's kicking in as I'm cranking up the mod wheel on my keyboard. All right, let's check out what the Rhodes is doing. And I'm actually going to go ahead and solo the Rhodes just because you haven't heard it by itself yet. I should note that I am applying a fun effect in Logic here. This is just the pedal board. It's a stock Logic plugin, and I'm applying a tremolo to it. It's a stereo tremolo, and you can see all my settings right here. Just a really fun way to add some cool color to a Rhodes. Okay, let's add guitar. And guitar is actually out at measure 9, and it comes back in at measure 10. All right, and we're going to add our drums here. Just doing some light cymbal work. Okay, let's add bass. Once again, we've dropped out all of our bass elements at measure 9. Okay, and let's add our vocals. And let's check out the word builder programming once again. So they are saying, remember always. And this is how I've got it programmed here. So you can see all the settings. And just remember that with those tricky compound vowel phonemes like I or way, it really helps to just sound the word out very slowly and see kind of what your mouth is doing. So for instance, let's take the I phoneme. Now, when you use that phoneme in regular speech, it just sounds like I. Okay, but really what you're doing in slow motion is I. You have this ah morphing to an E. And we can go ahead and look at how I've got the word night programmed. You can see that we are starting off with that ah, and after the end of the actual MIDI note, you then have the ah that is being faded out as the E is fading in. So just keep that in mind. And let's go ahead and check out what's happening in the brass. And we're going to go ahead and solo the brass by itself so that you can hear what it's doing. So I wanted kind of a da, 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 da. And I was able to get that with the key switch patch. And you can see all the programming here. Okay, let's go ahead and add strings. And that's actually everything, so I'm just going to unsolo everything here. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next section here. I think we covered everything in this section that I wanted to cover. So let's just take it from measure 11 here. All right, let's break it down, starting with piano. You know, again, not much to say there, besides just some beautiful playing. Let's check out the organ. You know, again, just the way that that patch responds to the mod wheel is just, it's so natural and just so satisfying. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if this patch responds to CC1 or CC11 because I have actually both CC1 and CC11 mapped to my mod wheel on my MIDI controller. So let's go ahead and check out what's going on in the Rhodes here. Again, just filling up some space. And the guitar. Same story there as the Rhodes, just filling up some space. And now for our drums. Just lots of fills, lots of cymbals, and some fun drum programming going on there. And now for our bass. And just a general note, you will typically want your bass to be following your kick. It's not really doing that in this particular part of the piece for the most part, but let's say that you were, in the chorus of your piece. You generally speaking want your bass to be following your kick drum. And pro tip, if you have some sidechain compression that is using the signal from the kick drum to compress your bass, you'll get a much cleaner bass response in your mix. Okay, let's add our backup singers. All right, and let's analyze this a little bit further. So they're saying, with his love we shall overcome. And I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to go through all the words so that you can see how they are programmed here. This is with, this is his, this is love, this is we, this is shall, this is the O, ver, come. And once again, you can see how I've got the MIDI data spaced out here in order to give the word builder patch time to sound out any consonants at the end of the words there. So let's actually go ahead and solo just our backup singers. I want to stop it there. They needed quite a bit of time to sound out that V, so you've got this larger space here. And I didn't need as much space here because that L at the end of shall sort of naturally flows into the O at the beginning of overcome. And they're ending this word on an R, and they begin this word on a K, and so I needed a good bit of space there. Now, I'm just using some of the pre-recorded phrases from Hollywood backup singers, and one thing that I do just want to point out is that when I write these demos, I am not writing sort of around the library. Okay, even when I'm using pre-recorded phrases like in Hollywood pop brass or Hollywood backup singers or Voices of the Empire for that matter, I write these pieces with an idea and then I make the libraries work around that idea. Okay, I'm not writing to the limitations of the library. And when it comes to East West, whenever they do these pre-recorded phrases, they just have so many of them. It's really just a matter of looking through them to find the right ones that work. So again, I'm not writing around any limitations here. I'm coming up with an idea and then I'm making the libraries work for that idea. So I just want to make that clear. Okay, so let's move on to the brass. And here you can see where I am using the key switch patch to give us those staccato articulations in measure 12 here. And then we go back to legato. Okay, and let's add our strings as well as the mark tree. Okay, and those strings really help to fill out the mix without making it too cluttered. I'm going to go ahead and let you hear what they sound like on their own, just so you can kind of hear how I have them mixed. Obviously, this isn't going to be the same way that I mix them for, a purely orchestral piece. It's a little bit more aggressive with the low and the mid cuts. Okay, so that is going to do it for the piece. Let's go ahead and check out the reverb setup. And we will start here with the piano. So the piano is being sent to my stage reverb, which is the Digital Hollywood Hall with the 2.7 second tail. And it is also being sent to the Northwest Hall rear room. The organ is also being sent to the stage reverb. If you see bus 14, that's just going to be this reverb here. So just keep that in mind. The Rhodes is also being sent to the stage reverb, as well as to a stereo delay. The guitar is also being sent to the stage reverb and that same stereo delay. Now, there are a couple things happening with the drum kit. We are also sending the drum kit to the stage reverb, but we are also sending it to a channel strip that I kind of call the faux space channel strip. I really like it for drums, and I actually got this channel strip setting from another mix engineer who kind of specializes in pop and rock mixes. And before it hits this reverb, it's going through a sample delay that sort of spreads the signal out, and then it hits the reverb, and there is some EQ on the back end as well. Now, bass is not being sent to anything, because you typically don't send bass to reverb. The vocals are being sent to the stage verb, as well as to a stereo delay. Brass is being sent to a short digital verb that's in Spaces 2, the classic digital A with the 1 second tail. It is also being sent to a delay as well as to our stage reverb. And finally, our strings are being sent to the Southern California Hall string-specific impulse, as well as to the stage reverb. Okay, so that is going to do it for the piece. This is actually the last video in this tutorial series. We've covered a lot of different styles of music, and hopefully you were able to get some really valuable information out of this video series. And we look forward to seeing you in future videos on the channel. And stay tuned for what's next, because there are some awesome things in the works right now at East West. Until next time, stay safe and stay well.